Bernie Sanders was criticized for
Right.
not being hard enough on reparations.
Mhm. There are a couple of things that come to mind with my thoughts about reparations. I have gotten in the habit in the last few years of asking my students a few questions. What share of the inmate population do Black Americans account for? Is one of the questions I ask them. What percentage of people who are murdered by police officers every year do Black Americans account for? And then, crucially, and the one most directly relevant to the charge at hand, what percentage of the total U.S. population do Black Americans account for? And the reason that I asked those three questions is I had a sinking suspicion based on class discussions we had with students, that they imagined that Black share of all three of those categories was much higher than the realities. And of course, I found, based on when my students respond to my three questions, my suspicion proved correct. That my students will generally tell me, and many of my colleagues, though not in the history department, will tell me that Blacks are anywhere from 80% to 100% of the inmate population. That Blacks are anywhere from, I was shocked, because they'll say 80%, or they'll say all of them. And I'll say, which would be 100%. I'll say, all of them? Really? There aren't any white people in prison? I'll say, okay, 80%. Same thing for people murdered by police. All of them. Oh, all of them? Any white people were murdered by cops? Okay, 80%. And then my favorite one is the response to what share of the total U.S. population. And the largest cluster will tell me anywhere from 16% to 40% to what share of the total U.S. population do Black Americans account for. Again, the largest cluster will tell me 16 to 40. A minority will tell me about 13%, between 13 and 14%. And that matters quite a bit, because if you imagine that Blacks are 30 to 40% of the total U.S. population, as a lot of people apparently seem to believe, then reparations seems more politically feasible than if you know that Blacks are about 13.5%, somewhere between 12.8, but I think more recently revised to about 13.5% of the total population. If you know that Blacks are more like 13% of the total population, then reparations isn't going to happen, right? It's going to be very difficult. It's going to be impossible to organize a base of support for that particular project, even before you get to the realities and difficulties of administration and whatever the political blowback might be. Because in those universal programs, you can actually generate a broad coalition of support to actualize them, broad coalition of political support. I would submit that the person who thinks that you can just guilt trip white people into giving Black people money is either a charlatan or profoundly naive, while Blacks are only 13% of the population. 13% of the population, a population that is comprised, in which poor and working class people are overrepresented. That 13%, you have to have a coalition that's larger than 13% to win. And begging people to be altruistic is not going to pay dividends.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like, you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Touré Reed, son of the legendary Adolph Reed and a remarkable scholar in his own right. I, funny enough, didn't actually know you were even related to Adolph Reed when I first found you on Theory Underground. It was the Theory Underground stream where I first came across you quite randomly because I've been working with those guys for a while. And I really liked what you had to say. It was very interesting. You were talking about your backstory, and then you mentioned how that related to your book. So I, as a result of that, picked up your book on Kindle, Towards Freedom, The Case Against Class Reductionism, published by Verso. Very fantastic book. And I would say, in all honesty, I think it's this book and Assad Haider's book, who Assad Haider, just for disclosures, my intellectual mentor, so I might be a little biased. These two books are probably the best books I've ever read on this whole debate when it comes to class reductionism, race reductionism. You're also a professor at the University of Illinois. But yeah, what made you want to write this book? And feel free to add anything I missed.
Oh, Tony, thanks for having me on. And I'll make one correction. I'm at Illinois State University instead of University of Illinois. So I'm about a 45-minute drive away from Urbana-Champaign. So thanks for the question. It's funny. I will begin with this. I actually didn't intend to go into the family business. My dad's a professor. His father was a professor, and his father was an educator in Arkansas. And I actually, when I entered college, I thought I might be an attorney or a heavy metal virtuoso guitarist, but I wasn't anticipating becoming a professor until probably my third year in college. And in my third year in college, I had completed a paper it was related to the Great Migration and the underclass debate at that time. And that became the basis for my senior essay at Hampshire College in lovely Amherst, Massachusetts, and informed my intellectual trajectory through graduate school and beyond. So my first book, Not Alms, But Opportunity, is on the history of the Urban League in its first 40 years. And one of the things that I do in that text is I examine the influence of Chicago School of Sociology race relations models on the Urban League's civil rights agenda. And particularly, I seek to complicate what's often referred to as the politics of respectability by highlighting the class tensions that inform Black politics, particularly as expressed in this very important civil rights group. The Urban League is the second oldest civil rights group in the United States. It's only 1 year younger than the NAACP and was a social work group. So its function overlapped the NAACP, but was discrete. If one were to read Not Alms But Opportunity all the way to the conclusion, what one would find is that the conclusion of Not Alms actually sets up Toward Freedom. Toward Freedom, I had actually anticipated would be my second book, and then I shelved it and thought I would work on something more directly related to what I do in Not Alms. But fate had in store for me moving what I thought would be my second book, which then became what I thought would be my third book, back up to the position of the second text. And what prompted me to move Toward Freedom up in the queue is the Sanders campaign, actually, and the backlash to the Sanders campaign by way of, and it's a multifaceted backlash, but there was a particular charge that Bernie Sanders faced beginning in the summer of 2015, I want to say, or early fall of 2015, where he was accused of being a class reductionist. And I wrote a piece in Jacobin magazine in August of 2015 that was a surprisingly impactful piece. I had anticipated being hated by that with the publication of that piece, and it explored the problem of the charge of class reductionism. And that essay was called Why Liberals Separate Race from Class. And the success of that essay prompted me, with some nudging from an acquisitions editor at Verso, to turn the essence of that article in the book, which again was what I had always hoped to write anyway. But unlike what I would have anticipated back in 2008, 2009, when my first book came out, the Sanders campaign gave me an opportunity to connect the issues, the problems that I saw in post-war liberalism and post-war liberal discourse on poverty, to current issues that were at the forefront of the minds of Americans at that point, which would have been, again, the path forward. There was, I would say in 2015, there was a clear transpartisan discomfort, if not rejection, of neoliberalism that one saw in both the Sanders insurgency and in weird and funky and wild ways with the unexpected rise of Trumpism. And at least on the liberal side of things, what we saw was New Democrats, the Clinton campaign and the DNC, using the charge of class reductionism and identity politics as a 1-2 punch to shift the discourse on democratic politics or liberal politics, ironically, to the right. And they did so ironically to the right again with the aid of identity politics. So I probably gave you a lot more background than you actually needed for how I came to the project, but the project is a reflection on maybe two basic things: my longstanding interest in the role of culturalist explanations for inequality in liberal thought and Black political thought in one column, and a desire to weigh in with the corrective in the late 20-teens and early 2020s on the problem with the commonplace mischaracterization of the Sanders campaign and others eventually like myself as class reductionists. And I would be happy to play with what it means to be a class reductionist in a second, but I'll just set that up this way. The charge of class reductionism seemed misplaced and wrong-headed, convenient, doing the devil's work, if you will. But it occurred to me upon reflection that really what was going on with many of those individuals who leveled that shotgun blast at a stratum of leftists and progressives was that they were motivated by what I came to identify as race reductionism. So there's our setup to talk about what race reductionism is, when and if you're ready for it.
But yes, no, I would like to go into that. But the first thing to address there is what you just brought up, which is 2016. And some of this debate sounds so 2016. I get a reaction sometimes that I see that whenever these things are discussed, like identity politics, people are like, oh, this is so 2016. It's so uninteresting. Why should we deal with it? And the reason why I do insist to have these discussions is because my reaction in 2016, I saw like the whole like Bernie bro slur, right? Or like the kind of whole idea that, you know, this, yeah, all the same stuff that you were reacting to, right? But I was under the impression this was just liberals, not the left. And like the people who were the problem were the liberals. Increasingly, I saw that a lot of this stuff I disliked about liberals, which was, you know, building very anti-solidaristic politics, I saw it on the left too. In fact, actually, probably more. I hear the class reductionist label used at other people on the left, actually. And yeah, so I guess what is race reductionism in response to class reductionism? Because class reduction is pretty self-evident, right? It's like you basically boil everything down to class. You don't think race matters at all. That's kind of the conception people have. But race reductionism, right? What's your hypothesis there?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I had thought class reductionism was what you described, except I thought that until I was accused of being a class reductionist. And the reason that the tendency to level the charge of class reductionism my way or my dad's way or Barbara Fields' way or Cedric Johnson's way was vexing to me was that I don't think any of us have argued, and I know I certainly hadn't, that racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., were inconsequential to people's lives, right? I mean, I have experienced racism. I have witnessed racism. I have helped friends get through racist problems in life that were informed by racism. I myself have had to take action against some powerful people once in my career who I believed were motivated in some part by racial prejudice. So I've never, ever argued that racism was secondary or irrelevant to people's life chances. And which means I haven't argued that eliminating economic inequality will by itself end racial discrimination. In fact, somewhere in chapter 4 of Toward Freedom, I state explicitly that if we were to wave a magic wand and end racism on Tuesday, end class inequality on Tuesday, racism wouldn't go away by Wednesday of that week or even the following week on its own, right? So considering that I had never argued what I'm accused of arguing and what I had thought a class reductionist was, it occurred to me that what a class reductionist is, when you get down to it, is someone who really takes seriously the social constructiveness of race, which would mean race is invented. It's not real, but it was invented by human beings. And we can debate when race was invented, but I would say it's a modern construct. Certainly race as we think of it today was invented essentially to explain why slavery could be compatible with democracy and liberalism, right? And so race as a construct exists to explain why some groups are exceptions to liberalism, at least race in the modern sense of what we mean it in the United States. But if that's what race is, then it can't take on a life of its own, independent of the material world. Race exists to explain inequalities that are the product of human beings. However, the work that race does, as in terms of its explanatory powers, is to reify those inequalities, to treat those inequalities not as the product of social relations. Dare I say, capitalism might be one of those relations, but rather to treat those inequalities as if they were the product of some natural process ordained by God or evolution or some other, again, natural process, right? And if that's, again, the work that race does, race is not identity. Racial groups are categories. And as such, you find a multiplicity of identities within each of those discrete categories. What a race reductionist is, and this, will get me to what race reductionism is, I suppose, because I have to talk about that, right? Because that's the real question that I've been asked. But what a race reductionist is, or what race reductionism is a tendency to abstract racial inequality from the political economic processes that generate it. Another, maybe more simplistic way to put it, and it might be even more helpful and a touch less abstract. If you look at the inclusive dates of what I cover in Toward Freedom, there's one chapter on New Deal, industrial democracy, and race. And that's a setup chapter. The subsequent chapters are on post-war liberalism. And that first chapter on New Deal, industrial democracy functions as a juxtaposition. That chapter is called something like When Black Progressives Didn't Separate Race from Class. And it explores the influence, again, of class politics on the way that Blacks during the New Deal and the Second World War conceived of the problem of racial inequality. And it was in fairly explicit class terms that race, once again, functioned as a vehicle for divide and conquer among the American working class, that race functioned as a vehicle for exploiting tiers of laborers and homeowners. In an era before affirmative action, it did so in really explicit ways because it wasn't illegal to discriminate against non-whites in that era, right? The subsequent chapters, as I say, though, explore the move away from a class-oriented understanding on inequality that takes place immediately after World War II, or the more succinct way to put that is during the Cold War and subsequently since. And the point that I make about post-war liberalism to explain what race reductionism is that liberal social policy and thought was not hobbled by class reductionism, but it was hobbled by race reductionism. And what race reductionism is, it isn't simply the tendency to abstract inequalities, racial inequality from capitalism. It is that. But an easy way to understand it is that liberal social policy has oscillated between two nodes, two different poles. Race as an explanation, this is liberal social policy to explain inequalities that we think of as racial inequalities. It's not capitalism. Liberals don't care about that. Our two options, explanatory options, are race in the form of Blacks' alleged cultural deficiencies and racism in the form of whites' alleged cultural deficiencies. And those two frames constitute what race reductionism is practically. In the Johnson administration, you saw both operating together, right? And Lyndon Johnson would be a liberal, so that's why I'm going to point to him. In the Clinton administration, and just to elaborate on how that would work in the Johnson administration very, very briefly, the best of the war on poverty attributed inequality to racial discrimination. The worst of it attributed inequalities to the cultural pathologies of poor Blacks. And you can see this in the Moynihan report and its influence on the Johnson administration. When you get to the Clinton administration, I'm going to skip Jimmy Carter, but when we get to the Clinton administration, what you see is following up on Reagan, and Reagan did this too, is the explanations for racial inequality centered largely on race, right? Blacks' alleged cultural deficiencies. And this had come in the form of culture poverty, which we had in the Johnson administration, or what it was called in the Reagan and Clinton administrations, underclass ideology. And underclass ideology, though class is in the compound, it's really not a way to understand inequality in terms of class. It's a way to understand inequality in terms of culture, the alleged cultural deficiencies of poor Blacks and Hispanics by Reagan and Clinton. And of course, culture might not sound like the worst way to explain it. I would say that culture is a pretty bad way to explain racial inequalities, in part because what people mean by culture often really isn't culture. It isn't what culture is supposed to be. Culture is fluid and dynamic. It changes. Circumstances can change groups or an individual's cultural understanding of the world. Underclass ideology presumed that there was a self-perpetuating culture of dysfunction that was impervious to external influences. That's not what culture is. That's a lot more like what race is supposed to be. And we saw this both in the Clinton administration and the Obama administration in the form of Obama's rhetoric on post-racialism, which I will just say this, that post-racialism is a bit of a misnomer. It's not only wrong-headed, it's essentially an update of colorblindness. But post-racialism, as the reactionary fantasy that it was really better understood as post-racism, insofar as President Obama traded in racialist, if not racist, underclass tropes with the best of them, just like Clinton and Reagan before him. What Obama was doing with his post-racial rhetoric was discouraging Blacks from complaining about racism or any other kind of systemic or structural impediments to racial equality. So once again, simply put, what race reductionism refers to is the tendency to abstract racial inequality from political economy, or put another way, liberals' attachment, and now at this point, progressives' attachment to a binary understanding of inequality that comes down to either race or racism, but not class.
Yeah, one way in which I like to tackle these big topics is like you start from the general, the kind of whole summary narrative, and then you go into the particulars, like one by one, and then back to the takeaway. I think it's a really good way to learn, and you set us up very well there. And one part of this book that what I got the most value personally from this book was that history. And I want to set up a question that is really two questions, and that will bring us in that direction. I think part of the reason why leftists often find this sort of discussion, quote unquote, uninteresting or don't want to think about it is because they think that it's been solved by like intersectionality, for example. They might hear what you're saying and say, well, isn't that just intersectionality? Yeah, we just need to add class. And the impression that I get from your work and what I get in contrast from what I learned in college a lot of the time is something very different, in the sense that the way in which I often hear intersectionality proponents talk about it is that these are separate struggles which sometimes intersect. Whereas the argument I get from you is more, these are just, class and race are inseparable. And that doesn't mean, as you said, right, that like if you get rid of inequality, you'll have no racism. But the opposite certainly isn't true. And you explicitly critique people who kind of think that like this is a totally different problem, and that's where you get like completely different solutions, right? Which is the idea you just need to educate people to be like less racist in seminars. And I know like, Robert DiAngelo and Ibrahim X. Kendi are sometimes like considered low-hanging fruit in this like critique, but like, I mean, that is the conclusion if one takes it separate, right? And one of the narratives I actually heard, which you kind of very much challenged what I had previously thought on, is one thing I would often hear from the types who talked about intersectionality was that the New Deal did not benefit Black people, or that they were left out of the welfare state because, which probably contains a large kernel of truth, right, to some extent. But the way then in which that was positioned was to say like, the social democratic politics you might envision, you might want. It's like that and racism, separate things. Because look, the New Deal, might have benefited white people, but not black people. You really highlight how much the New Deal did benefit black people, and you highlight stuff like the Wagner Act, and you highlight black union organizers like A. Philip Randolph, who I've heard about previously from your father's work, and his talks on Michael Brooks that I used to listen to a lot. But yeah, I want you to get into that, the New Deal, and why is this period so important for understanding when it comes to this broader discussion?
That is a lot. So I'll do my best to respond as concisely as possible, which is famous last words coming from a man who gets paid to speak in complete paragraphs, if not essay format, as my wife teases me.
No, go off. This is the platform for it.
I was really surprised, in the last decade or so, to hear people, the discussion of the New Deal that came to dominate. And I think the timing of the reimagining of the New Deal as a set of policies from which blacks didn't benefit is really fascinating and telling, because there's a whole body of scholarship that goes back to when I was a child that explores the foundational relationship between the New Deal and the civil rights movement. And, as I often say, you really can't have a civil rights movement without the New Deal, because the precedent for state intervention in private affairs, which is essentially what affirmative action is, right? This is what anti-discrimination policies that come about in the 1960s in explicit and unambiguous ways, but also, court decisions too that date back to the 1940s center on the view that the government can intervene in private affairs for the public good. That is not a product of the 1960s and 1960s oriented civil rights discourse. That couldn't be. Blacks were 10% of the total population, 10 or 11% of the total population at the time that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had become law. Once again, they were 11%, maybe at most, of the population when President Johnson signed the executive order establishing affirmative action in 1965, right? How could it possibly be that the government would have the power to intervene in private affairs for the public good for black people, period, as the narrative that narrows this capacity to the 1960s would have to insist upon? That precedent was set during the New Deal. It was set during the 1930s. President Roosevelt had the good fortune of making 9 appointments to the U.S. Supreme Court, which transformed jurisprudence in the United States, making possible, once again, cases like Smith versus Allwright, which in 1944, which ends the white primary by way of the expanded purview of state actors, right? So this is an anti-discrimination case in 1944. Similar 2 or 3, you could say, similar cases related to unions also in 1944, verdicts were rendered limiting the ability of unions to discriminate along racial lines, once again proceeding in some part on the spectrum of extended state actors. In 1948, Shelley versus Kramer makes the restrictive covenants illegal, once again proceeding somewhere on the spectrum, or from the view that is somewhere on the spectrum of an expanded state actor, and so forth, right? You couldn't have those cases, those Supreme Court cases and others, without the change in jurisprudence that was ushered in by the New Deal. But more to the point, a really easy way to appreciate, without doing any kind of deep dive, the importance of the New Deal to Black life comes down to just looking at voting returns between 1932 versus 1936. And in 1932, everyone knows, I'm sure, that Blacks tended to vote Republican in national elections from 1870 forward, right? Things began to change from 1870 until sometime in the 20th century, I'll say, at least for now. That, of course, began to change during the Great Migration as Blacks in cities like New York were incorporated into local machine politics. And in New York, even as early as 1928, you start to see the so-called Black vote tilting in national elections, kind of Democrat, right? In 1932, more than 70% of Black voters voted for Herbert Hoover, the Republican. 4 years later, in 1936, you have about a 100-degree flip or 180-degree flip, where over 70% of Blacks voted for Roosevelt in 1936. So the Black vote, the so-called Black vote, has continued to trend in national elections in favor of the Democrats. That begins with Franklin Roosevelt in his second term. And the reason for that is not that Blacks were collectively lobotomized and voting against their interests. They were voting for their interests because they did, in fact, benefit from New Deal programs. Of course, I think part of the problem is that people will learn correctly that policies like redlining put homeownership beyond the reach of most Black Americans, right? And that's a fact, and that is a fact from 1934 to 1968 without any meaningful caveats. But there are also a lot of other New Deal programs. And I'm going to come back to redlining in a second, but there are also a lot of other New Deal programs. There were direct relief programs and there were work relief programs. And depending on the state and when, Blacks were generally speaking overrepresented among recipients of direct relief because they were overrepresented among the unemployed. The New Deal's ability or the willingness or whatever verb you want to use to dole out relief to Blacks varied from state to state, right? The degrees to which, in other words, a non-awkward way to put it, or a less awkward way to put it, is the extent to which Blacks benefited from the New Deal, varied from state to state because the New Deal policies were administered at the state level. And in the South, Blacks faced, as one would anticipate, horrific degrees of discrimination. But when you move up from the South to the North, this is where you're going to find Blacks are, generally speaking, overrepresented among relief recipients in terms of their numbers or percentage of the population of a city like Chicago or a city like New York or a city like Detroit. In terms of Blacks' needs, given how high Black unemployment was in relation to white unemployment, Blacks did not receive relief in equivalent to their need because, again, Black unemployment, I'll shorthand this, slight oversimplification, but in urban areas could range from 40 to 55%, something like that, right? But once again, Black Americans absolutely positively benefited from New Deal direct relief programs and even work relief programs, which are the better versions of them. New Deal programs established quotas to permit access to public housing constructed by the Public Works Administration. New Deal programs established quotas to permit access to employment and construction, Public Works Administration, apartment projects and other construction projects. Those things and many more announced the comparative openness of New Deal policies vis-a-vis Blacks. And I think part of the hangup that people have is that the point of reference that many of us use is an ahistorical point of reference. Point of reference we use to make sense of the New Deal would be taking racial sensibilities in 2025 as the lens that we apply to New Deal programs. What you'd be better off doing is applying racial sensibilities in 1925, because what you're going to see if you use 1925 as your point of reference for how the New Deal operates in 1935, you're going to see a great deal of improvement. If you use 2025, by contrast, you're going to notice appropriately the discrimination is going to jump out at you, but what you won't have is the context of the degree of discrimination and disadvantage that Blacks faced before the New Deal. And if you think about this as on the basis of incremental change, and that is, for better for worse, how change comes about in the United States incrementally, particularly for matters such as race, then the New Deal ushers in, or I should say lays the foundation on which the civil rights movement would benefit or be built rather. And of course, the New Deal would transform the parameters of Black politics. I'll say one other thing. There are a number of consequential things that happened during the Depression decade that transform, American politics, of course. So a number of big ticket items that transform American politics, but Black American politics too. And they would include the pushback against eugenics, which begins during the 1930s, and that's a necessary precondition for a civil rights movement. They would also include a labor civil rights alliance, and it's not all of organized labor, but the labor civil rights alliance is coming from the Congress of Industrial Organizations. The Congress of Industrial Organizations proved to be, in the context of its moment, a civil rights ally, because blacks were, of course, overrepresented among potential laborers. But also there were a lot of communist organizers who had an ideological commitment to racial equality that were part of the mix. And of course, you'll witness the maturation of civil rights groups during the 1930s. So there's a convergence of things that happened during the New Deal, but crucially, the New Deal, what it does is it establishes the capacity of individuals and as blocks, as interest groups, to turn to the state for redress. And partly because of that, in the context, of course, of the New Deal's overarching aim being to right a listing capitalist economy by ensuring that the workers in American capitalism have a more equitable share of capitalism's rewards, hence the Roosevelt's endorsement of organized labor, particularly industrial unions. That framework that I just laid out establishes the capacity of the state to intervene in private affairs for the public good, without which there could be no civil rights movement. So hopefully I didn't blather too much. There's so much more to say about this, but I'll pull the pin on myself.
No, this is knowledge we need to soak in, because this is the part I found probably most surprising. Well, I get it's not surprising upon just learning it, but it's one of those things that it's like, why wasn't I taught this? Because the part about Roosevelt kind of winning the so-called black vote, and which we'll talk about how that relates to Bernie, because I thought that was a whole interesting discussion. But like, I have the narrative that I always grew up hearing was you had the New Deal, which was like benefited the white working class and helped capitalism, which of course, both of those are true, but that the black votes didn't switch to the Democrats until basically the civil rights movement. That's kind of like the narrative that you see in like that. I mean, it's not explicit, but that's usually like how renditions of American history. And it's weird because like I've read a fair amount of American history, and usually like you only see the black vote being emphasized really with the Civil Rights Act. Like they'll say, it starts earlier than that. Of course, Kennedy, right, embraces civil rights legislation, but like it's really when when LBJ does the Civil Rights Act, and then of course famously says that the South is now going to all go Republican. And this like whole part about the New Deal gets kind of skipped over, and how that actually like helped the civil rights movement. Not it's like separate. That's something that I just want. Like I did wonder why that doesn't get emphasized as much, because if anything, like that is such a obvious example as to how someone like Bernie Sanders, who had a much more had a much more radical platform than Roosevelt did for the working class, that would disproportionately benefit black people. And I remember that famous interview where Bernie Sanders was on The Breakfast Club, and he was asked, well, what are you going to do about black people? And he said, well, my programs are going to disproportionately benefit black people. And they said, no, but like what specifically? And they were really pressing him on that. And then the media tried to spin Bernie's lack of ability to kind of, I guess, answer this sort of loaded question as a reason for why he lost the black vote, even though that particular interview was 2016. But like this narrative of him losing the black vote being tied to so-called class reductionism was really like, as you know, really with the Biden, when he lost to Biden, because he did lose the black vote to Biden. That's what I'm a little curious about, is like, you talk about that relation. We'll get back to the history, but I think because just Bernie is often compared to Roosevelt a lot, So yeah, I wonder about that, because it's a hard thing to combat, just because he did lose the black vote, right? So yeah. What do you have to say on that?
Couple things. So I do want to go back to history just for a hot second. And what I also want to stress, and I made the reference to redlining. this is relevant to what you describe as your account of what you learned in school about the so-called black vote and when it flipped from Republican to Democrat. What's interesting about this, I referenced a book that, that there's a scholarship that demonstrates the link between the New Deal, the foundational role of the New Deal to the civil rights movement that goes back to when I was a child. Harvard Sitkoff's A New Deal for Blacks, which came out in 1978, is kind of a foundational text. And there are a couple of generations of scholars who built on that book, myself included. My first book builds on Sitkoff, and to a lesser degree, so too does Toward Freedom. But a host of authors, of professional historians and social scientists do. I want to stress something before we move up to the contemporary. It's not just that I would have learned in college, and I learned this in college a long, long time ago, about the foundational role of the New Deal to the modern civil rights movement. I also learned about the discrimination that took place within the New Deal and the basic fact that Blacks did not receive their fair share, even if they benefited from the New Deal programs, with exceptions of things like the FHA. However, the narrative, the history of the homeowners loan corporation's redlining and the FHA's redlining has become very complicated, and Black Americans benefited quite a bit, depending on the city you're talking about, from the HOLC policies, the homeowners loan corporation policies, which bailed out homeowners who had defaulted mortgages. And in some cities, I believe like Philadelphia, it seems that Blacks may have been overrepresented, interestingly enough, among recipients of HOLC mortgages, which refinanced defaulted subprime mortgages into 15-year mortgages that on better terms. And that is worth noting. But the problem of FHA redlining, the problems of discrimination in New Deal, the administration of New Deal, direct relief and work relief programs, the omission of agricultural and domestic workers from the Social Security Act for the first 15 years of the Social Security Act's history, that's well known, right? I mean, scholars have been talking about that since the 1970s, for Christ's sake. It's interesting that New Democrats discovered that only in 2016. So now we can jump up to where we are. And it's particularly interesting because in the 1990s, New Democrats like Bill and Hillary Clinton, let's say, had referenced the universal programs coming out of the New Deal as an alternative to targeted programs, among them affirmative action, in fact. And one of the ironic things about Hillary Clinton's attacks on Bernie Sanders as a class reductionist is that it was her husband in the early 1990s who was flirting with gutting affirmative action. Bill Clinton in the early 1990s is one of the many reasons that, though I've been a registered Democrat since I was 18, and I was certainly old enough to vote in 1992, and one of the many reasons I sat out the 92 and 1996 presidential elections was precisely because of Bill Clinton's New Democrat stance on the welfare state, affirmative action, and crime. And Bill Clinton in the early 1990s suggested that we should, his mantra about affirmative action was mend it, don't end it. And in that era, that might not sound that bad, right? But in that era, what mend it, don't end it meant was it was a capitulation to what was then the right wing's caricature of affirmative action as quotas. Now, quotas have been illegal since 1964. You would have been hard pressed to find formal quotas in any anti-discrimination initiatives that any corporation or university had in the 1990s. You had affirmative action programs that were not necessarily as well conceived as they should have been, to be sure, but rigid quotas had been illegal since the 1960s, right? So what Bill Clinton's mend it, don't end it was doing was what he was doing with that easy to remember characterization of where to go with affirmative action is he was on one hand walking the fence, but on the other hand, he was signaling to conservatives that he would be willing to trade off affirmative action or something, right? And so it was fascinating to watch Sanders get hit the way that he was hit between 2016 and 2020, when, at least in the case of 2016, for sure. It was Hillary Clinton's husband who had flirted with gutting affirmative action. It was bizarre to watch Hillary Clinton say things like regulating the big banks would do nothing to address systemic racism when she is the super predator woman, right? She was, in retrospect, the Crime Act was the Crime Act at this point. But in making the retroactive case for the Crime Act, she drew upon underclass tropes in the form of the super predator metaphor to make a case that there was a criminal class in America that was a subrace, and that subrace just, happened, at least in the popular imagination, to be disproportionately Black and Hispanic, for whom there was no reason to show mercy. She was very clear that the systemic origins of crime were irrelevant because the urgency of now necessitated building more prisons, establishing mandatory minimums, and executing more people than we had executed previously, because this subrace of super predators was irredeemable. Well, I will add, keeping it 2016, it was all the more galling to hear Hillary Clinton say regulating the big banks would do nothing to address the problem of systemic racism, not since she didn't care about systemic roots of inequality in the 1990s and was explicit about that, but regulating the banking industry would have done quite a bit to address the problem of homeownership, the problem of the extent to which Black Americans were devastated by the mortgage collapse in 2008, which was owed in some part to her husband, Bill Clinton, signing into law the piece of legislation that deregulated the banking industry, right? So there was a really interesting sleight of hand that the Democrats had engaged in, ignoring their own disingenuous use of universal programs in the 1990s. And I should say this because I think I stepped away from this point. In the 1990s, the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party was making a case for universal programs as part of their case against AFDC and affirmative action and policies that Blacks benefited from disproportionately, though not exclusively. They were making a case for universal programs. The problem is, and I think that's what some of us hear or heard when we heard Bernie Sanders make a case for universal programs. But I just said the case that they made in the 1990s was a disingenuous case. What made their case, the New Democrats' case for universal programs in the 1990s, disingenuous is that they weren't pushing for universal programs that would benefit the American working class. And instead, they not only chipped away at targeted programs that benefited poor people and disproportionately Black and brown poor people, to be sure, but poor people, they also chipped away at the union movement by way of NAFTA. And though we don't seem to think of Black people as having class because, having class divisions in Black America, because we tend to, in the United States, abstract Blacks from the world of human affairs by way of a weird and wild and often racist language of race. Black Americans are overrepresented among unionized workers in the United States. Black Americans were overrepresented among auto workers, so they were devastated at higher rates by NAFTA than whites were. Black Americans are overrepresented among public sector employees who are unionized as well, from school teachers to secretaries and many points in between. So there was, again, this really funky, bizarre reimagining of the recent American past and not so recent American past that was part of a larger effort to marginalize Sanders through this language of, wait for it, race reductionism, and a weird expectation of particularist, or I should say branded policies that were to be Black exclusive policies, right? That it was not enough in that moment to point out that Blacks would be overrepresented among the recipients or beneficiaries of policies like the Fight for 15, right? A right to a job at a living wage, let's say, or a return to taxpayer funded tuition-free public education or national health care. Blacks are, overrepresented, of course, among people who take out student loans to pay for college. They're overrepresented among workers who don't have health insurance. They're overrepresented among the poor and the working poor specifically. So Black Americans would have benefited disproportionately from the Sanders platform, as you alluded to a while back. But the D's endorsing of, in a weird and ironic way, of policies branded as Black specific policies as a vehicle for marginalizing Sanders, was a convenient ploy. And I think we're all going to witness what a convenient ploy that was over the next few years as they walk further and further away from those kinds of framings. And I suspect that instead what they'll end up embracing is some version of the DLC's line back in the 1990s, but we'll see what happens there. I don't know if I exactly answered your question because I tried to be overly ambitious by connecting the dots between the earlier discussion and this one. But
Okay, so you were just giving a huge rendition of history, which I find very valuable, by the way. I appreciate it. And there are some things that maybe we should like narrow in on a bit. Is when exactly did the shift occur from a kind of Black class politics, really, to a culturalist politics, which you write about being kind of having its mirror on the right? And you talk about the Moynihan report, the report that kind of just diagnoses a lot of the issues in the Black community to things involving culture, and how that gets picked up by neoliberals. You also critique this sort of culture turn and how it has like a weird anti-racist progressive variant and a kind of, in many ways you could say, like, yeah, a right-wing neoliberal variant. I want you to kind of clarify when that occurred and how that occurred, because I think that's interesting, because it does help us look at the fact that there was a time in which before you could have like radical Black class politics. And I think many people are aware that that did occur, but they usually, most examples people hear about are like Black Panther Party or, MLK's own class politics, but not like the literal trade union organizing aspect, which of course A. Philip Randolph is a very important for. That's a part of history I kind of want you to elaborate more on, this sort of shift and the way it's impacted the way we see like racial discourse today.
okay, so it would take place very clearly and easily in the Cold War. Now I could make this more complicated than it has to be, but we will just not. And I'll say that where in the 30s and 40s, Blacks, like whites, tended to talk about class inequality in pretty explicit ways, and Black Americans and Black and white progressives tended to see racial inequality through the lens of capitalist political economy. It's in the post-war era that we return to a kind of culturalist explanation for inequality. And it comes from a lot of different avenues, but I think the easiest way to appreciate what the appeal would be of culturalist explanations for inequality by the early 1950s, if not the late 1940s, would be to consider in the context of the Cold War, how it would play to a generalist audience to wed racial inequality to capitalism. And in the context of the Cold War, describing racial inequality as an element of capitalism, that slaveholders, let's say, were motivated by a desire not to simply racially oppress Black Americans, but rather to exploit their labor, to have a class, if you will, race will be the word, but a class of rightsless laborers who they could extract wealth from more easily. They needed a captive labor force, slaveholders did, right? The Jim Crow era, a version of the same thing happens, that the point of Jim Crow is not simply to oppress Black people. If it were simply that, then among other things, you'd have to confront and explain in wild and crazy ways why many white Americans in the South lost their right to vote too. But the point of which is true, many white Americans did in fact lose the right to vote. In a state like Texas, I want to say about half the people in the convict lease system were white. Texas is not Mississippi, where the vast majority of people in convict lease, I think there were virtually no whites in the convict lease system in Mississippi, but Texas is a different story, right? a very large percentage of the victims of crop lien, which is not slavery, but it's also not free labor, right? It's on the spectrum of serfdom, but a very large percentage of the victims of the crop lien system in the Jim Crow era were white, right? The majority, of course, of blacks were trapped in that system, but again, a large percentage, one more time, of people who were trapped in that system were white. You'd have to explain that if the point of Jim Crow was simply to oppress black people. Jim Crow functioned, among other things, as a kind of divide and conquer. It was really important in the wake of the populist insurgency in the South, which constituted very complicated interracial working class pushback, political alliance, pushing back against the bourbon elites in the Jim Crow South, right? And one more time, Jim Crow was one of the many mechanisms used to break that up and to exploit an even more diverse collection of workers. So think about that before you even get to the urban North in the 20th century, where you can also see racially tiered labor markets and racially tiered housing markets. And those racially tiered labor and housing markets, they functioned, when you get down to it, as a way to divide and conquer, of course, but to depress the wages of not just blacks or other non-whites back in that era, including Italians and Jews, and a host of others. And that era is going to be, let's say, the 1920s North. But interestingly enough, racially tiered labor markets depress the wages of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who could have been replaced at any point by racially inferior workers, right? So again, and we'll just end there, if you have all of those things that I just said as part of the mix of what racial inequality is about and what racism is about, the language for reifying material inequalities that are organic to capitalism, how the hell is that going to play during the Cold War? Because it would function as a conceit that capitalism, that American democracy, of course, has substantial limitations, particularly that are baked into the system. And that's a particular problem when you get to the era of decolonization, when the great European powers cannot, in the post-war era, maintain their colonies in Africa and in Asia, et cetera, right? And of course, Latin America is also the site of freedom movements, if you will. So in that particular context, and more, much more, but we'll stick with that, class-oriented understandings of what race is about and what racial inequality is rooted in would, of course, lose favor. And it would lose favor among philanthropists who fund research. So researchers are going to move away from class-oriented understandings of inequality toward culturalist understandings in the realm of social psychology, but also in other kinds of fuzzy culturalist frameworks. The one that I talk about is called ethnic pluralism. And ethnic pluralism is technically a formal rejection of biological race. It existed, ethnic pluralism as a construct, predates World War II, but it gains quite a bit of traction following World War II because, one more time, formally ethnic pluralism rejects biological race. Practically, ethnic pluralism does not move as far away from notions of biological race as ethnic pluralists imagine themselves to do, because they presume that ethnic groups have discrete cultures that have a durability that transcends changes in environment. And in that sense, ethnic pluralism is kind of like Lamarckian race theory, which predates eugenics, as an easy way to put that. But what ethnic pluralism does, one of the ways that it functions, is to explain inequalities. It explains why housing markets look like what they look like, that white people just like white people, Italians just like Italians. So they cluster together, right? And so it can function, these affinities, these ethnic affinities can function as sort of organic barriers to progress. Even as ethnic pluralism presumes, and this should sound familiar, that diversity is our strength, that the multiplicity of cultures that we find in ethnic groups function to make America stronger, not weaker. So that doesn't sound so bad, except when you understand that the multiplicity of cultures that ethnic groups have are actually a lot more like what race is supposed to be than what culture is, you do have a problem. From ethnic pluralism, it's a hop, skip, and a jump to culture of poverty frames that, at least within, again, 1960s era American politics, culture of poverty frameworks function once more as a way to describe inequalities that are organic to capitalism as if they were the product of the cultural deficiencies of particular populations. And again, in the context of Cold War, you got to explain lingering inequalities in the age of prosperity. And racism becomes one way to do that. And racism certainly a contributor, and a significant contributor in the 1960s without much in the way of caveat. But from the vantage point of Cold War liberals, the cultural deficiencies of certain populations, Appalachian whites, poor Black Americans and inner city youth, and as well as rural Blacks as well, would more and more be understood by some strata of policymakers as the source, those cultural deficiencies, as the source of lingering inequalities. So again, I think, I hope this isn't an overly simplistic but needlessly wordy way to describe the context that makes culturalist explanations for inequality more attractive in the post-war era. But hopefully that's a decent enough jump off.
So a couple of things I want to narrow in there, because some of those seem like, oh, you're just like making a kind of intersectionality type of critique by just adding class. You're making a quite radical argument. I want to narrow in on it, but first, just that context you provided, like the Soviet Union also being like the US's competitor, the fact that they could use in their propaganda, point out that America didn't have, like, people weren't drinking out of the same water fountains. So it's like that's pretty bad, especially when you're trying to compete over influence in Africa, which was also a huge Adolph sphere of influence. And so like it makes sense why there was a greater push, but like the culturalist way to do it is like easier and more compatible for a capitalist system than the idea of like allowing workers to do, which racism originally emerged to prevent, which is like uniting, essentially building solidarity across racial lines. And the culturalist, almost anti-racism, seems to be like a compatible anti-racism for capitalism, the way it seems from what you're describing. And this does echo some stuff that I've heard your father Adolph Reed say in a talk called "Anti-Racism is the New Racism," which I want you to elaborate on, because this does seem like, whoa, right? You're not like equating, right? Of course, you're obviously not equating racism and anti-racism, but like that in serving a kind of similar function, like this, which you were saying earlier about sounds like cultural diversity being dangerously close in many ways to kind of racial essentialism. That's something I think worth narrowing in on, because I think that's probably the most profound point that I've seen you make.
So I think it's
That's
interesting.
lacking in the discourse.
Yeah,
That I think is just totally lacking.
So I think it's interesting that you point to what the point that I'm making seeming like a variation on intersectionality. And it's funny, I've never drunk from the trough of intersectionality, in part because when I entered college, intersectionality, the term, didn't exist, or it was just invented, right? Kimberly Crenshaw had just coined that phrase or that term right around the time I entered college. But the thing that was sort of funny to me about it is when I entered college, a lot of my professors were legit leftists, I'll say. And the holy trinity among legit leftists, and I'll describe legit leftists as Marxists, the holy trinity among Marxists in that era, this is the very end of the 1980s, the beginning of the 1990s, was race, class, gender. And so the notion that leftists were not invested in race, class, gender is, before intersectionality, is bullshit. It's not true. Again, I will repeat, that was the holy trinity before Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term. The difference is, I think, that the way that leftists in that era, Marxists in that era, talked about race, class, gender wasn't identity. These were categories that announced race, class, gender were categories that announced social relations. They were not intrinsic identities. From my vantage point, having, grown up in a multiplicity of environments, but for some stretch of the back half of my childhood, grown up, gone to schools that were predominantly white, whenever I'd hear white people say, just to be blunt or real about it, that there were real Black people, and that's not the term they would use, but there were real N-words and then not real N-words. What they were doing was drinking from the trough of identity politics by another name, right? Because they presumed that there was a singular Black way of being and seeing the world, right? Navigating the world and understanding the world. And any Black person who deviated from that wasn't really Black. For most of the history of race in the United States, most Black Americans and most decent white people who, rejected racism would have understood that framing to be fundamentally racist, right? Because what racial groups are fundamentally categories. This is why you find a variety of perspectives among all racial groups, right? Because they don't exist in nature. They're not bound together by any intrinsic qualities. They're ascriptive categories. And so part of the problem that a category of leftists might have with intersectionality is that it tends to treat categories that function to announce social relations as if they are intrinsic identities. As you said as well, and this is in keeping with the point, the metaphor carries with it a problem. The metaphor presumes that race, class, gender, we'll just pick those three because of the multiplicity of identities that you could draw from, but we'll just pick those three for now, that race, class, gender have separate lives and then from time to time come together in people. And from my vantage point, that's wrong-headed, that race, class, gender are inextricably bound together. You can't disentangle them, right? They're all part of who we are, and so much more is part of who we are as individuals. I can't pull out what is my Black understanding of the world from my man understanding of the world, right? From my heterosexual understanding of the world. There's just one me that has a lot of things going on like everybody else. And again, these aren't identities that are intrinsic for that matter, right? How we see ourselves doesn't exist in a vacuum. That's shaped, of course, by social relations as well. But that's a problem that many of us might have with intersectional frames, even as many of us who have those problems certainly appreciate the importance of studying race, class, and gender, because these are things that, of course, shape outcomes in life. You mentioned my pop's discussion of anti-racism as a form of racism, and I won't purport to speak for him, but nor will I channel his spirit per se. But I will say that I believe what he's talking about, and I'll draw from my own observations, is that metaphors like race is our original sin or racism is our original sin are really problematic. I would submit they're really problematic, even as I think people who use those metaphors often 7 times out of 10 are coming to those conclusions with the best of intentions. But if one thinks about the metaphor, which is just the sort of mystical version of race is in our DNA, or racism, is in our DNA, which is another version of the same thing, then what you're doing is you're taking what's in effect a commitment to an ideological construct that has a large cultural footprint. And that's what race is. It's an ideological construct that has a large cultural footprint. And what racism would be an attachment and following through on the implications of those ideological or cultural commitments. But you're taking, again, something that is the product of human beings that had a start point, but doesn't go on autopilot. It morphs, it changes, it's tweaked. And I shouldn't have used the passive voice. The historians don't like the passive voice. Who's tweaking it? Why is it evolving? Race functions to explain these inequalities in civil society in naturalist terms. And so what does Rogers Brubaker call them? ethnopolitical entrepreneurs of one sort or another reimagine what racial group interests are. Marcus Garvey would be an example of an ethnopolitical entrepreneur. A. Philip Randolph's penchant for calling his opponents Uncle Toms might also announce that he was on some level an ethnopolitical entrepreneur. Certainly Stokely Carmichael was. Newt Gingrich is an ethnopolitical entrepreneur, right? So some of them are better than others is what I'm getting at. David Duke would be another ethnopolitical entrepreneur. So again, I'm going to stress some of these are better than others, but nevertheless, the parameters, the meaning of whiteness, of blackness, and Hispanicness. And Hispanic's a wonderful example because that is a category. Again, I'm not going to say it's an identity. That's a category that was invented in 1970. That was the product of ethnopolitical entrepreneurs in the form of Chicano activists, Puerto Rican activists, and Cuban activists. And of course, in one column, and the Nixon administration in the other column. But anyway, so that one should be easy to demystify since it's, 54 years old, going on 55 years old. But those frames, again, are contrived by human beings. Anti-racist discourse, which often is bound up with notions such as racism is our original sin, or frameworks like white privilege too, which I'm happy to pick on for a second. So if you'll ask me, because I bet I'm going to go off in the wrong direction for that, but they tend to treat racism, in keeping with the original sin metaphor, as something on the spectrum of 18th century, late 18th century natural aversion ideology. They tend to overlook the fact that these racist dispositions are nurtured and instead presume that groups have sort of intrinsic or quasi-intrinsic affinities and by extension, adversarial relationships with outgroup members, who, however they are defined, that are somewhere on the spectrum of primordialism. And it's quite disturbing, having had my fair share of conversations with ironically racist white anti-racists. And I have had a lot of conversations with ironically racist white anti-racists over the years that were the stuff of probably shortening my life expectancy by way of the cognitive dissonance that I endured with people who insisted on the one hand that they were anti-racists and were certainly part of the solution. But on the other hand, insisted there were unique ways, Black people had a unique way of seeing the world that was distinct from whites. And that those Black people who didn't were inauthentically Black. Now, it's bad enough when Black nationalists said that, but I could see that because that's their trip. To have white people say, this takes me back to where I started, right? To have white people, well-meaning, explicitly anti-racist white people suggest that a Black person who doesn't read from the playbook of Black identity as they see it, or as their Black cultural tour guide had defined Black identity for them, but to have these white people then say that so-and-so isn't really Black because this person has sensibilities that aren't really sensibilities that are Black sensibilities. They like skiing. Let's say you're not supposed to like ski. I don't like skiing. I don't like the cold, but it's not because of race. But anyway, they like skiing, or they're Marxists, or they're at the other end of the spectrum. They're conservatives too, right? That means that they're not really Black. WTF, as we didn't used to say, but that I'm fond of saying these days. So what I'm getting at through a lot of blather and a lot of ranting rooted in my own frustrations about these realities on the ground and the ironies that drive them, that some chunk of anti-racist discourse, Robin DiAngelo, proceeds from fundamentally racist understandings about what racial groups are. And that is that they're groups rather than categories. And I'll pick on one of those things that I waved at, white privilege as a framework. It's been my experience, and I think I said this, I can't remember if I said this when you were recording or not, but I am on sabbatical at the moment. And that means I don't have to go to meetings. Yay. But the one category of meetings that I go to still, I choose to go to, are meetings related to racial, sex, gender identity, inequality, right? Because I believe in those kinds of products, what people used to call diversity meetings or DEI meetings. And I will go to the reimagined version of those kinds of meetings because I believe in the work as much as I hate that phrase, doing the work. But it's been my experience in the realm of when people use the term white privilege, there are a couple really problematic things that are happening that are counter-solidaristic. They may or may not be racist, but they're absolutely counter-solidaristic and profoundly problematic for more than that reason. One of the things that happens is it would seem as if there's a presumption that all whites are privileged and all blacks are underprivileged. When you have the conversation with people who use that term, though, usually what is revealed is they will concede that there are poor white people in America. How could you not concede that there are poor white people in America? They're around. But then they'll say that at each class tier, it's worse for blacks. Have you heard this? At each class tier, it's worse for blacks or other non-whites. I don't disagree that it may be worse for blacks or other non-whites in each class tier. But here's the thing. What do you get when you call that a privilege? Or I guess a better way to put it is that what those people are describing that makes it worse for people of color at each class tier and that they've described as a privilege is that white privilege is bound up to. What they're describing is that blacks, of course, at each class tier face discrimination. And what these individuals then are describing as a privilege is freedom from discrimination, right? Because what makes white privilege within the frame is that whites don't face racial discrimination. Okay. Now, when I was coming up until very, very recently, freedom from discrimination was the bare minimum. That was not a privilege. That's what everyone was owed. We have now taken, by way of this language of white privilege, what used to be the floor, freedom from discrimination, and made it a privilege. At the very same time that we've compressed rhetorically diversity, if you will, diversity of class experiences among whites out of existence. Just as we've done the same thing with blacks, we've compressed out of existence with that frame and its corollary, which presumes that all blacks are underprivileged because we face discrimination. We've compressed class difference out of existence by way of this framing. I don't know if that's racist. I think it can be. It's certainly race reductionist, I would say. I would put that in the parameters of race reductionism. But that aspect of anti-racist discourse, I think, is what my father was getting at. And I'll say this about anti-racism as a construct. The absolute best of anti-racism, from what I have seen and read, is anti-discrimination. And that's important and good stuff. Anti-discrimination policies are important and necessary and appropriate. The absolute worst of anti-discrimination, I think you alluded to this earlier, is anti-racism training. And I think the anti-racism training or the DEI training has proved to be a real problem, coming from the best of intentions or rooted in the best of intentions of some practitioners, but not likely rooted in the best of intentions with your HR department. Because I don't think your HR department has good intentions when it comes to that kind of thing. And I would say that where anti-racism or DEI training or whatever ends up creating some problems, at least as conceived, is this. And I'll go by way of a question. So you'll have to unmute yourself, Tony, just for me to tease this out. So is it legitimate for one, is it legal for one to fantasize about robbing a bank? Is that legit? Is that legal to fantasize about robbing a bank? Okay. Is it legal, legit to rob a bank? And why isn't it legal to rob a bank? There's a social harm, right? Attached, you're stolen someone's property and a lot of people's property, I guess, if it's a bank, but there's a social harm owed to that. Why is it not illegal to fantasize about robbing a bank? How do you enforce it? And there's no social harm, right? There's no ill. Okay, let's take this to civil rights law. And this will relate to the counterproductive elements of DEI trainings, because DEI encompasses a lot of things. Many of them should have been unobjectionable to most people, in my humble opinion. But I suspect in most people's minds, DEI comes down to two things: affirmative action, which it isn't really. And the second thing is the training, because that's how most of us, I think, experienced DEI. And those who found it off-putting, I think that was, ground zero for what they found off-putting. So here's the thing: anti-discrimination law did not make it illegal for you to be racist in your mind and in your heart, because there's no consequences for having those attitudes. No one cares. It's not the government's right to tell you to like people, right? And to associate with people on your time. With anti-discrimination law, and this is what I never really liked about anti-racism, because we're focusing on the attitude, which is racism. What we're not focusing on linguistically is the behavior, which is discrimination. And the discrimination, which is rooted in racism and the racist attitude, the discrimination is the action that's consequential, that was illegal, right? Before the executive orders and the recent executive orders and Supreme Court verdict, who knows how this is going to work out now. But from 1964 to, very recently, anti-discrimination law did not touch your attitudes. You were free to have racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, fill in the blank attitudes. What you were not free to do in the public sphere was to discriminate against people. You were free to fantasize about robbing the bank. You were not free to rob the bank. Anti-racist trainings, or DEI trainings, attempt to comply with or enhance the maybe spirit or the letter, judgment call of the law. They tend to complement the law, anti-discrimination law, right? And maybe complement the letter of the law. But in a sense, they violate the spirit of the law, insofar as the spirit of the law was not about affecting, shaping people's attitudes. It was only about shaping their behaviors. So anyway, and I should say they comply with the spirit of the law, but not the actual letter of the law is how that works. Because the letter of the law is about the behavior. It's not about the attitude. So that was, I think, a bridge too far for a lot of people. And in that sense, it kind of ginned up opposition needlessly. I've never cared if my coworkers or classmates had racist attitudes. People have a lot of messed up attitudes. What I always cared about is how they behaved in a public sphere. My friends are a different thing. I don't want my friends to have messed up attitudes. Ideally, I don't want my family to have messed up attitudes. And of course, I don't want them to have messed up behaviors. But as far as strangers are concerned, right? As far as strangers are concerned, what matters really is their behavior. The behavior of your coworkers matters, not their attitudes. The behaviors of your classmates matter, not your attitudes. The behavior of your landlord matters, not the landlord's attitude. And one more time, I think that some people who were committed to DEI or anti-racist training or whatever you want to call it, came to it with the best of intentions. They wanted to make the world a better place by addressing the problem of bad attitudes. And I get it, except they were also ignoring the fact that you are actually entitled to have bad attitudes. We don't want you to, but if you're grown, that's your prerogative. So that, of course, is not quite what my father was getting at, I suspect, but I can't really speak for him, about anti-racism, being its own form of racism. But I think the first point that I made was on the spectrum, since oftentimes, again, anti-racist frameworks presumes the existence of discrete racial group perspectives and interests, which we used to understand to be racist. And so that's a problem. And it oftentimes presumed that racism had taken on a life of its own, that it was an inexorable demon. I don't know if you like horror movies, but the imagery that comes to mind for me with how anti-racists, a lot of people who were in the anti-racist universe, like Robin DiAngelo would be an example. The image
I was thinking Tyler Perry.
Okay.
When you were talking about anti-racist racism, I was thinking a bit about Tyler Perry, because when you said something about racism being in the DNA, I thought of a phrase that it often comes up in that kind of sphere, which is like slavery being in the DNA, and that
Mm-hmm.
as a result, there's this inherent like complete difference between black people and white working class people, like black working class people, white working class people, because the slavery is in the DNA, and as a result of like whites, not being enslaved, the white supremacy is in the DNA, and
People say that. I mean, hashtag Black
it's like,
AF makes
yeah,
that very point that very way. I think in the first or second episode, and it was pretty jarring because that is kind of an epigenetic understanding of what race and racism are. It's very similar to, it's kind of similar to ethnic pluralism, but it's even more similar to Lamarckian race theory. So Tyler Perry makes sense as an example. I was going to say the image that comes to mind for me, or the movie reference that comes to mind for me with how someone like Robin DiAngelo describes racism is the Babadook. And I don't know if you've seen the Babadook. It's an interesting Australian horror film on that takes the possession metaphor as a commentary on grief and mental illness. But in that context, the demon can never be fully exorcised, but rather only held at bay, because this demon is mental illness within in the Babadook. And for Robin DiAngelo, it seems that the way that and she's not alone, she's just an obvious one. The way that racism works is that it cannot ever be exorcised fully, right? Exterminated. This is the Protestant version of the original sin metaphor, actually. Its sway is always there, and it's your job as a good anti-racist or a good Christian to resist the temptation to sin as a racist, right? But the temptation to sin as a racist is always there within the original sin metaphor. And I don't think practically it's that hard to not be racist conceptually, insofar as if you reject the tendency to stereotype, that might help. I'm not saying that's sufficient, but the first step in that process would be to reject the rightness of stereotyping. And unfortunately, within a lot of the kind of DiAngelo style discourse, there is an embrace, if you will, of stereotyping the other, right? And that complicates things. But again, I think that my old man was getting referring to something on that spectrum.
yeah, I brought it up because I saw it paralleling the whole discussion you have of ethnic pluralism, and yeah, something that I found very odd in the university.
Mm-hmm.
I could say, like, okay, I think Canada under Justin Trudeau is kind of like if the Obama era just continued, but
Yeah,
more aggressively.
sure.
It's like Idpol land. And I experienced this both in university and in the government, where they have a lot of like DI type hiring, where they'll hire extra women and indigenous people. Because for us, that's like our original sin, right? Is,
Mm-hmm.
the genocide of indigenous peoples.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
I encountered the most liberal racist stuff ever. Like just when it came to like, having one native guy and making him do like all the most stereotypical native things for these
Mm-hmm.
holidays that were supposed to celebrate culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it just it was very odd. And one thing I very much remember in particular is in a history class when we were about to learn about the founding fathers and particularly discussion about Jefferson and slavery. And they said, well, and the professor said, trigger warning, this might cause trauma to some people. And I was genuinely very, very confused
Mm-hmm.
because I was thinking like, this assumes something that's an incredibly infantilizing assumption to
Mm-hmm.
assume that like black people, by just hearing about slavery,
Mm-hmm.
would just break down and couldn't like listen. It's just like I view that as kind of racist, frankly. But you see that a lot, like the tearing down of statues. Sometimes the justification is, and I'm talking about like, not just like Robert E. Lee. I'm just talking about like, J- Washington, for example, right?
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, they own slaves and that can cause trauma. And don't you want to be inclusive of Black people or Native people? And I'm thinking, I feel like this is a little racist, like in itself, like the assumption that goes into that good intention act, because it's like you mentioned the well-intentioned people, and I do even see this from leftists who are sometimes afraid to actually double down on fully class politics because they'll say, oh, it might like alienate minorities, alienate Black people, and I'm thinking like, so you don't think working class Black people are smart enough to know that they have like they would benefit from proposals that would benefit working class people?
Mm,
And obviously history shows that that's the opposite, right? With
right.
your discussion of the New Deal. So yeah, I don't know what you think
I mean, it
about the
can be
whole thing. I
racist,
mean,
the assumptions, but I do think, I mean, and they wouldn't always be. I think that at least the trigger warning frame is always somewhat infantilizing, irrespective of whether or not it's racist. And it certainly bespeaks some changes in the culture. And among the things that would be kind of surprising to me about it is that, and I'm not surprised because I've been a professor for a long time and I know a lot of professors who use trigger warnings and I know why. I've never done them, but because I figure if you're taking an African American history course, which is mainly what I teach, that you have walked in understanding that some unpleasant topics are going to come up, right? That's kind of a given. And I would say that should be a given with any US history course, whatever the topic. It should be a given, whatever the broad topic, it should be a given that from time to time, if not daily, some unpleasant things are going to come up. But I guess what's odd to me about this culturally is up until recently, most of us Americans hadn't presumed that we needed to be comfortable every minute of every day, that being put out of your comfort zone is something that was just bound to happen at some point, as because it's part of the quotidian experience, right? Not everything breaks your way every single day or every minute of every day. So, cope. It never occurred to me when I was a young person anyway, when I had learned about horrible things like, I don't know, discrimination within New Deal programs. I didn't melt down. I got angry. I mean, there are other emotions besides despair that one can draw upon if you want to be emotional about it. It's also the case though, and I think we don't think about it this way so much anymore, that, an intellectual enterprise necessitates sober analysis. It calls upon you as a grown up. Anyway, it's different if you're 10, but it calls upon you as a grown up to do your best to put your emotions aside to try to make sense of what you're learning about. Right. And at some point, of course, it's reasonable to draw upon your emotional reaction to it. And from time to time, you may just immediately have a visceral reaction to something that's uncontrollable. Right. It's an immediate reflexive reaction, I should say. But when trying to make sense of it from the vantage point of study, you have to do your best to check your emotions and make sense of why these people who are engaged in behaviors, who embrace attitudes that you don't share, that you think are problematic, they may actually be problematic in a way. And if one embraces lowercase d democracy, there's nothing wrong with trying to make sense of the logic behind it. But I think we do tend to think of efforts to make sense of the logic behind why people do things that we don't approve of. We tend to think of that as endorsing the logic. I don't get it, but I've noticed this for a good 25 years, I would say, that this has been our default. And trigger warnings, I think, are maybe partly an expression of that, along with the expectation that we be comfortable every second of every day.
yeah. So there's a few other things that I want to ask you. One of them is actually about the radical Black tradition.
Hmm.
And I say that with air quotes because that is a term used to describe a very broad set of political groups and movements that have very different politics, frankly. But I find it one thing that I kept thinking about when you were saying like this sort of new anti-racist view of how racism works, like it being all in your head, and it's just something that You need to tackle it at the root of the people's minds, attitudes. In my view, this is at the heart of what quote unquote wokeism is. Like, and I want to talk about that in the back room a bit, because that's a term that has become very confusing due to mainly how the right uses it just to criticize anything they don't like, right? And as a result, some people don't want to think about the term. But I think like the word wokeism is interesting because I think the meaning is in the word itself. Like this idea that politics is about people coming to their senses and not like a class relation and like building solidarity on mutual interests. And it also happens, the word itself does happen to come out of the radical black tradition, which is, you know, it brings some interesting discussions. So we're going to talk about that in the back room, as well as your take on reparations and the recent election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And because, of course, that's reignited a lot of the debates as to what extent race played in that. And yeah, if you're not a patron already, highly recommend doing so. You get access to over 55 exclusive episodes, cheaper than overpriced coffee. So you can just for just 1 month, you can make your damn coffee at home and become a patron and listen to the rest of this conversation. Thank you for being here, Touré. I think you've enlightened all of us, and I hope people listen to you and read your work.
Thanks for having me.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.